Good afternoon. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is Intersections, which is a program of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. I'm Connie Ryan, and I'm hearing a thing. Is that better? Sorry. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being on live stream as well. We are very glad to have you as part of Intersections. Intersections is a monthly luncheon, essentially through the school calendar, September to May. And we have a variety of speakers talking on a variety of topics. So we are delighted to have you here today. Really, Intersections is about civil dialogue on important issues that impact all of us in our communities. So today we are going to talk about racial inequality and specifically redlining in Iowa. And for some young folks, that is a newer term, and for some of us who are older, it has come into our understanding. It wasn't necessarily something that we understood in years before. So we are delighted to have Sydney O'Hare, who is a lifelong Midwesterner who earned her BA in history from DePaul University and her MA in history from the University of Iowa. Go women, Hawkeyes. Yay!
Very exciting.
How many are going to watch the game tonight? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Her academic interests primarily focus on modern United States history and how historical trauma is reflected and understood in public spaces and museums. As the museum educator at the African American Museum of Iowa, Sydney is excited to team up with other Iowa organizations and institutions to showcase Black history around the state. And so won't you give a warm welcome to Sydney O'Hare?
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm Sydney O'Hare. That was kind of like the whole normal gist of what I say. So thank you for saving me some breath. I am the museum educator at the African American Museum of Iowa. So we'll talk a little bit about like who we are, and if you think we're open yet, we're not, that's okay. But we're temporarily working like 2 minutes down the street. So I was very excited to not have to drive very far for this program. Usually that Des Moines drive is like after post Black History Month, I'm very over driving to Des Moines. That drive is not fun. They have got to put more interesting things for me to look at out there. I'm over it. But yes, I'm the museum educator. And so we at the African American Museum of Iowa, we just celebrated our 30th birthday. If you've been over by Nubo, you're probably familiar. Oh, thank you. You're probably familiar with all the construction that's going on over there. The city wanted to put in a flood wall, and then we just decided to redo our whole building. And so we are opening officially on May 11th. We have $1 admission day on Saturday, May 11th. We're super excited. We've been closed for a while. I've never actually worked in the physical building. I've only ever been at our temporary location. So all week we were putting our stuff back in the archive. That's been like the big, slow process. And I've been finding a lot of like really cool things and not being super helpful because I don't really know where anything goes. But yes, we're super excited to be here. We are the only institution in the state of Iowa that solely focuses on Black history, and we're very lucky to be located here in Cedar Rapids. We are sort of the brainchild of the Methodist Church, AME, African Methodist Church. There we go. I'm totally blanking on my basic facts now. And so what's really cool about our institution is that we started by people who were really passionate about the idea of spreading Black history. We didn't really start from people who had a lot of experience in museums. And so now we've sort of developed into a very big institution with a brand new, very pretty building that has really nice smelling carpet right now because no one's really walked on it. So today, I know that you guys tend to be like a very question-heavy group, and so we're kind of going to speed run through the like basic stuff about this presentation so we can get right to the meat. So sorry if I talk a little fast, but I promise that you'll be able to ask me more questions about all the things I've learned about how to buy a house very shortly. So today we're going to talk about some of the key words that we have to understand and define in order to fully kind of get a good grasp on what racial segregation in the housing market looks like. We're going to talk about the importance of housing just from a historical perspective, but really touching on that economic and cultural component of like why Americans are so obsessed with buying a house. And then we're going to see how some of Iowa's cities have been redlined over time and what these long-term impacts are going to look like and sort of why housing keeps coming up as kind of the most important issue when facing things like environmental justice and education policy. All right, so in order to fully understand sort of the scope of racial inequality when it comes to housing, we have two factors of racial injustice that we have to define. So we have the idea of interpersonal racism, and then we have the idea of systemic racism. And while these two things feed one another, they have very different outcomes. So when we're talking about interpersonal racism, this is when we're really talking about the way that you would interact with an individual who was of a different racial makeup than you. So this is sort of like walking down the street. Do you feel comfortable sitting next to someone who is a different race than you on the bus or at the grocery store? These are much more of those person-to-person interactions. But these interactions are often used to understand more systemic policies. So if a person who has these interpersonal racist beliefs goes on to become a lawyer or a judge or make laws or become a police officer or the guy at the bank who can deny you a mortgage, they're going to bring those racial biases with them into that position of power. So this is how we start to see the development of systemic racism. So this is laws that either purposely or accidentally exclude people of color, policies, sort of those interpersonal interactions where one person has a lot more power just because of their job or their standing in society. So these two types of racism, they both fuel one another and kind of continue this big cycle. So when we talk about sort of getting rid of that interpersonal layer of racism, right, of like being able to conceptualize that people have different racial makeups and like that's what makes us unique, that change also has to be done at the systemic level in order for us to see sort of that economic, cultural, political shift as well. So when we're talking about how this applies to housing, we're also going to have to use the terms de jure and de facto segregation. So we have interpersonal racism and systemic racism fueling one another, kind of building on one another, enforcing each other. And then they're going to turn into de jure segregation, which is legally bound segregation. So I always remember it like jure, like jury. Otherwise, like that's all I got. I'm not a lawyer. So when we have, and kind of our Jim Crow laws before 1955, right, before Brown v. Board gets rid of the idea of legally enforced segregation. This is when we're starting to see things like racial covenants in housing. This is much more of these very like explicitly outlined policies about who can access public resources and private resources based on their race. After 1955, this is going to look different because we're going to get the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board, which is going to overturn any sort of legally sanctioned racial discrimination. And then we're going to get the development of de facto segregation. So de facto segregation is that segregation that we still see today when you look at like the racial makeup of a school or the racial makeup of a neighborhood. This is that stuff that's sort of, we can't really pinpoint the exact cause or like one exact policy that has grouped people by race, but it's that stuff that's developed over time. So when you look at a city like Milwaukee, where I'm from, you can see there's a very clear de facto segregation right down the middle of all of the white people in Milwaukee live on one side of the highway and all the people of color live on the other side of Milwaukee. Even though there isn't an enforced method of segregation there, that's the way things have developed historically because of the layers of interpersonal and systemic racism building and building under de facto segregation. Any questions so far? I'm like speed lawyering. One time I gave this presentation and someone just asked me how to get out of jury duty. And I was like, I cannot stress this enough. I am not a lawyer. I am just a historian. So all of these factors are going to kind of culminate into the idea of redlining. So redlining, it starts off as a term that's developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s. But today it's what we talk about when we see how racial segregation has been impacting neighborhoods in the United States. So redlining is officially described as the illegal discriminatory practice in which a mortgage lender denies a loan or an insurance policy restricts service to certain areas of a community, often because of their racial makeup. I promise we'll explain more of that in very shortly. So when we see the creation of redlining, we're able to trace back the importance of redlining and the importance of home ownership throughout American history. When you look at sort of the emphasis of policies from both a federal and a state level, the idea of owning your own land and owning the home you live in is sort of seen as like the crux of how you can have some economic mobility in the United States, right? So when you look back at the history of voting, we really tie this idea of who can vote to who owns land, right? Who owns property, who has that economic capital to be able to make decisions about government. As we start to expand who is allowed to vote, we still see this idea that like your economic standing means that you are allowed to participate in government, not vice versa. But we also really start to see from the 1930s onward, so like really Great Depression era on, that home ownership is often seen as like the have you made it in America, right? It's very American dream heavy. So we start to see this idea that your home is really where you can like put your social standing, right? If you are in a financial pinch, you can remortgage your home, you can sell your home. If you have a home, it means that you have a set location to live in, so you can vote, you can participate in the education system. And really all of our federal policies and our state policies after the 1930s are really gonna be hyper-focused on who can own a home and how can we help you own a home more. So from here, during the New Deal, we get the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the New Deal is a really important part of talking about redlining because before this, the federal government just kind of like let you do kind of whatever you wanted and wasn't gonna help you out. But the New Deal is kind of the first time that we start to see this new focus on like, what if we made it easier to like not starve to death in America? So the New Deal is going to create this new system where the government will help banks help you buy a house. So basically what we see happening is people are able to go to banks and say, not only can I afford to buy a home, but if I default on my loan and I fail to pay it, the government won't make you lose any money. So it makes banks a lot more likely to invest in people who have never really been able to put up that type of capital to begin with. But we also see that banks are not really wanting to like loan people money if they don't think they have the strata to pay it back. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation starts to map out different neighborhoods in pretty much all mid-sized to large cities in the United States. We know we have at least 8 maps of cities in Iowa. The most recent one we found was Boone. They redlined Boone. Who knew? But we start to see these maps that are literally just like maps of cities that are colored in with colored pencil. And so areas that are marked in green or blue are considered to be like the most insurable, right? These are people who have more of that economic capital, who aren't likely to default on their loans, or properties that you could make a lot of money selling. And then areas in yellow and lastly red were considered to be low desirable. So usually they're close to factories, they're close to railroad tracks, or historically they've been home to the largest number of immigrants and people of color. This is where we get like literal red lines being drawn around chunks of cities. And we'll take a look at what that looks like in a little bit. What's really interesting about HOLC redlining too is that it's not primarily focused on racial makeup, but it is heavily enforced by racial makeup in a little bit post-World War II. So we have a lot of neighborhoods like here in the Czech Village that are redlined because they're home to a lot of immigrants. And some of these immigrants are people of color, some of them are white people, but they're kind of considered to have the lowest economic capital. And so we get redline neighborhoods that are a little more racially diverse than we would first assume, but a couple other policies are going to happen in a few short years that start to really heavily segregate these neighborhoods and explain why we associate redlining so heavily with anti-Black racism. So we have the New Deal, we go to World War II, we're done with World War II. That was your World War II lesson. After World War II, we're like, that was awful. We have to have something to help reboot America, and we get the GI Bill. What's really important to understand about the GI Bill is that in order for it to be passed at a federal level, Southern states say, we can do the GI Bill, but we want to be able to decide in our state who qualifies for it. So we have this big federal chunk of money, but it's being given out by states themselves, not by the federal government. So this allows states to use their same Jim Crow welfare regulations to deny the GI Bill to a lot of African American veterans that are both men and women. So another important component of the GI Bill is, again, we're pre-1955, so segregation is totally legal in most American states. The GI Bill is supposed to give veterans money for public universities, but at this time, the majority of public universities, especially in the South, are not integrated. This money, though, doesn't get to go to private universities, so it doesn't get to go to historically Black colleges. And so a lot of veterans are coming back from the war. They're technically allowed to access this pool of tuition money, but they don't have a place to use it at because they aren't allowed to be admitted to places like University of Alabama, University of Mississippi due to their race. So we start to see automatically this way that the states are distributing the GI Bill is going to be very different than how the federal government intended it to be. All right, I'm still speed talking. So we start to see that right away, if you're coming back from World War II and you're accessing the GI Bill, if you don't have sort of that economic capital or that ability to pick up your whole family and move them to a state that admits Black students, you can't access the state guaranteed welfare system that the GI Bill is supposed to be providing. In the same component, the GI Bill is also giving the VA the ability to sort of back up your mortgage if you go to the bank and say, I would like to buy a house. However, if the VA knows, because it's your local VA, that you're a Black veteran, they might not be able to sign off on your mortgage. The person behind the desk might be like, I know that guy and I don't want to give him a house. The bank might not want to sign off on your mortgage because of their, again, systemic and interpersonal racism. And so we start to see automatically in 1944 onward that the ability to move out of a red or a yellow neighborhood is going to be heavily determined by your race. So even though we have these red and yellow neighborhoods that are mapped out by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, it's really hard to get out of them if you don't have that backing from the bank to buy a house in a blue or a green neighborhood. And this is how we start to see redline neighborhoods become heavily, heavily segregated. We also start to see this boom of the suburbs. So if you're returning from World War II, you're white, you have a college degree, and you have a GI-backed mortgage, your ability to move to a home that you couldn't otherwise afford, but now you have a new job and you have a new backed mortgage is going to be heavily increased. So we start to see people are looking for more and more homes. We start to see our homes get physically larger. This is where we start to get this suburban sprawl. And these suburbs are primarily using veterans benefits as a way to both recruit people and maintain their tax base. Another important part of the suburbs is that we have a lot of evidence to point to suburbs were using their racial hegemony to recruit people to live in them. So people would say oh, our suburb is all white. Don't you want to come live with people who have the same economic and racial makeup as you? This is when we also start to see school districts that are recruiting families to move to them because of their racial makeup. And then we start to see this heavy suburban sprawl that is going to lead to people living further away from where they work. Eventually, they're going to need transportation. We'll get to that in a second. That's another really important example. But all of these are sort of building on top of one another and explaining why we start to see these inner parts of the city that used to have a pretty diverse economic and racial makeup become heavily stratified and start to look much more similar to one another. We also start to see a lot more evidence in the most recent years now that a lot of these GI Bill era documents are becoming available for public consumption. We have a couple examples of some really heavily racially stratified areas. Probably the best example is we have 2 of the 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in Mississippi going to Black GI residents. And then in New York and New Jersey, so areas we really associate with having a much more diverse racial makeup, We're seeing fewer than 100 of 67,000 mortgages going to people of color. So these are like, it's much easier to see like the tangible number of just how insanely stratified we're starting to see our cities develop into. Once we have the GI Bill ending in 1956, only a year after Brown v. Board, we start to see that, again, these suburban neighborhoods versus our inner cities are only going to be increasing in the way that they're segregated. We see that this lack of economic diversity in a lot of cities, with most upper class people moving to the suburbs, is going to lead to a huge decrease in the tax base. This decreasing tax base is going to explain why these public housing projects that are actually super successful at both providing people of a lower income with housing, but also of integrating working class people, these public housing projects aren't going to have the funding needed to sustain them, and they're going to end up closing and kind of giving public housing the reputation that it starts to develop and still has to this day. We're also going to see this booming of de facto segregation once de jure segregation is outlawed in 1955. So even though the GI Bill primarily only exists pre-Brown v. Board, the results of it are all going to take place after segregation is officially outlawed. So this is when we start to see a lot of these questions about how to integrate school systems when there technically isn't segregation hardcore on the books anymore. Oh, I'm a little squished. That's okay. I'll talk over it. We're also going to get in 1968 the Fair Housing Act. So a lot of people can point to the Fair Housing Act as like a really great idea, but that doesn't have a lot of teeth to it. We can also tie the Fair Housing Act directly to the death of Martin Luther King Jr. So only a couple days after he is murdered, the Johnson administration passes the Fair Housing Act to sort of try to placate the masses. And a lot of the Fair Housing Act has been amended in the last couple of years. When it's originally passed in 1968, it makes it illegal to discriminate on rental and sale on housing based on race. It does not include gender or disability or family size until 1988. And to this day, the federal Fair Housing Act does not include sexual orientation. So technically at a federal level, it's totally legal under the Fair Housing Act to discriminate on someone based on their sexual orientation. We're going to see a lot of housing activists still looking at the Fair Housing Act as like, if we just did the Fair Housing Act, like if we just enforced it and funded it, we'd solve a lot of the problems that we have today when it comes to who can live where in the United States. So I think that that's a really good example of like, if you just paid attention to it, like we could fix it. All right, so we're chugging along. You guys are a great audience. I see you nodding, and I really appreciate that. So we're kind of post-1950s, right? Very like white picket fence in the suburbs, hyper-segregation within our inner cities. And we start to see this new push for, as the suburbs are growing, it takes a really long time to get to work. And so people have to drive from the suburbs into the city, and we need a place for them to put their cars. We start to see transportation having a really important impact on how housing is going to look within cities. And this is when we get urban renewal, or as some activists call it, urban removal. So urban renewal is a really important concept when it comes to why you can't like walk down the street and necessarily point at redlining examples today. A lot of them are destroyed during urban renewal to make room for things like highways and freeways and sort of these like kind of how to get to work systems. We're going to see that the cities are able to buy land to build highways to get people from the suburbs into the city because the land they're looking at is the cheap land that's been historically redlined, right? So if people are living in neighborhoods where their houses are not worth a lot of money on the general market, if cities have more political sway over communities because of their voting restrictions or their economic power, it's much easier to commandeer their land and to use it to buy it out through an eminent domain or to buy it for pennies on the dollar than it would be to like go to the suburbs and be like, we're tearing this down and building a parking garage. We're really going to see like our prime example of this in Des Moines. We have examples throughout Iowa, but the one in Des Moines is very, very clear and very stark and has a very long impact on the Black community that's living there. But then today we primarily see urban renewal through the act of gentrification, which is a word I like never say correctly, gentrification. And this is when we start to see people coming into historically redlined neighborhoods or low income areas and building housing that the people who've always lived in that neighborhood can't afford to move into. What's really important to understand about urban renewal is that even though it sounds like a good idea of like sort of trying to reboot a city's economy, what makes it so devastating to historically redlined neighborhoods is that there's nowhere else for people to move to. So if all of a sudden the housing prices increase in an area, the people who are already sort of at that bottom tier can't find a place to go to. And this is how we end up with like hyper crowded, hyper segregated neighborhoods. Whoop. Another important part of redlining that is kind of like the biggest way we still see it today is within the racial makeup of schools. So a lot of these suburbs are using their racial makeup to recruit people to move to their school district, to fund that tax base, and to increase their educational opportunities for their students. I went to a school that was developed in the 1950s as like a direct result of redlining. So, you know, if you did, that's okay. Like, it's not your fault. That's just the nature of the beast that we're living in, right? So I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the results that we see today, they aren't something to feel bad or guilty about as long as you understand them and see how they've impacted your life. So we start to see that as we're trying to integrate a lot of school systems, we have this idea of busing. And busing is sort of the best way we see schools integrating because no one likes it. And so everyone's mad about busing, which means that it has to be working because it's not satisfying anyone. We start to see with Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, the Supreme Court allows for busing. It says you can force schools to be integrated through moving kids around throughout the city. But only a couple years later, we have the Supreme Court saying you can force people to bus, but it only can happen when schools are created to deliberately exclude kids of color. So when you only have schools that are built pre-1955 and directly in their policies say this is a school for white students, you can integrate those schools forcibly through busing, but you can't with any other school. Otherwise, busing has to be optional. That's a really big problem because suburbs don't really start to grow until after 1955. And by 1955, a lot of states, including Iowa, have technically taken Jim Crow laws off the books, and we're left with a lot of this de facto segregation sort of as the remnants of it. We also start to see that as schools are starting to become forcibly integrated, or people are starting to use the Fair Housing Act to sort of get out of these historically redlined communities and move up that economic ladder, we get this really big boom in private school funding. And so this is something that we as Iowans have been talking a lot about, but we start to see people who are using private schools as a way to escape forcibly integrated public schools. And so this is why we get this booming growth, especially in the suburbs, of people who are using private schools as a way to continually isolate themselves both economically and racially. So when we look at sort of the today's standards of redlining, we really can tie a lot of redlining issues with health and safety to how people have ended up in the neighborhoods that they have. So when we're looking at the percentage of African Americans in Iowa who are arrested compared to like their general standing within the population, it's significantly higher in these redlined communities because redlined and low-income communities are overwhelmingly have a larger police presence. So if there's more cops around, there's just a higher chance that people will be arrested. When we have things like health and wellness, which we'll see an example of in a second, we also see that neighborhoods that have been historically considered undesirable or were redlined in the 1930s are still way more likely to have lower life expectancy rates, higher cancer rates, and just overall a lower quality of life. We also see that grocery stores are a really big indicator in how healthy a community can be. And so in historically redlined neighborhoods, we have just fewer options to buy fresh produce, right? This is when most of the places you can buy food are going to be like the corner store or even just a liquor store, but there's no option for buying like fresh produce or fresh meat. Whereas in a high income neighborhood, businesses look at that general economic standing as people who are able to afford higher quality food. We have a couple examples of this, and so I'm going to do this one first. Okay, so going back to our example of Des Moines. Des Moines is a perfect example of the impact of urban renewal on a Black community. So when we're looking at this map of Redline Des Moines, the river goes right through it, and that D2 section, so right here, keep your eye on that section. That's our important part. So that D2 section is the Center Street neighborhood. That is where historically most of Black Des Moines residents have lived. They had their own Black business district. They had community centers and Black churches there. It was sort of seen as like the hub of not just Black Iowa, or not just Black Des Moines, but Black Iowa in general. Oh yeah, perfect. I put a little box. So we're going to see that this neighborhood is marked as undesirable or low quality, right? As we get to the outside parts, especially over in that A area, over in B1, this is today what Des Moines general suburban areas. But when we build a highway in 1968, it is going right through the Center Street neighborhood. So as we have people moving out of the inner city of Des Moines and into these suburban locations, they're driving to work directly on top of the Center Street neighborhood. I'll run that back one more time. Oh, if it'll let me, that's okay. So yes, we're going to see how when these highways are built, it's the cheapest land you can buy is the land that has been historically neglected, both politically and economically. When we're looking here at Cedar Rapids, a really cool resource that we just kind of like found and that the city put together is the environmental impact of redlining in Cedar Rapids. So Cedar Rapids is primarily redlined in those areas around the river. Someone asked a really good question of like, isn't the river like in living by water, isn't that very desirable? It is now because we like regulate it, but in the 30s, it was gross and you didn't want to live there. So that explains why, especially areas in Dubuque, along the Mississippi, in Cedar Rapids, right along our river, they historically have been considered low value, but now we kind of clean them a little better. So now they don't smell as bad. So our neighborhoods here in Cedar Rapids were primarily redlined down in this middle chunk. And then when you put the heat map on top of it, we see that we have a lot of evidence to point to in general, but especially here in Cedar Rapids, that historically redlined neighborhoods in our city are way more likely to be hot. And this is explained primarily by the way the infrastructure is set up in a lot of these redlined areas. The parks tend to not have trees or grass. They tend to be primarily blacktop. Sidewalks and pavement absorb heat really well. And so the less green space you have, the less shade you have, just the hotter the environment is going to be. And I purposely broke this one down because there were just like a lot of colors going on. So this is our map turned to the side, just so it's a little bit bigger. This is the heat map on top of it. When you look down and you see these blue areas, especially kind of over by where the airport is, up near the top by Hiawatha, they're much cooler, right? The blue is like much chiller. Even yellow and like kind of that light orange is cooler than that bright red that we see downtown. And we can really tie this directly to how much pavement and shade is like physically available for the residents in these neighborhoods. In some areas of North and South Carolina, they just did a really big study where they found that historically redline neighborhoods are 20 degrees hotter than neighborhoods that were in the blue and the green. I don't handle heat very well, so I cannot imagine how hot it is over in the Carolinas. But we can really see this environmental impact, not just in, how likely our people are to access the doctor or to find a grocery store that has fresh produce, but also just like how hot is their house and how comfortable are they allowed to live in an area that they might have historically been forced into. So that, oh yes, and then we'll have a side-by-side comparison just because there's too many colors going on here. I don't know how you would ever print this in black and white. You wouldn't understand what's going on. But yes, again, so we have that center of Cedar Rapids with the river going through it. That's our river on our redline map from the 1930s. And we really see that direct correlation between, you know, a desirable neighborhood in the 1930s, much more likely to still be super hot today. So that is all I have for you. I'm right on time. I'm so happy. But I'd be happy to take any questions. Please don't ask me for financial advice. And otherwise, that QR code just links to a survey about the program you saw today. I apologize if I talked kind of fast, but I'm ready to answer any more questions you might have and scoot around my PowerPoint. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. If you have a question, if you'll just raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you and catch my eye ahead and I'll know who I'm going to next.
Can you give what you know about the history of Tyler School in Southeast Cedar Rapids?
Ooh, Tyler School.
I think it was the black school when I was a little kid. I went to Grant Wood, and I think in 5th grade, I was asked to introduce Bryant Knox to Grant Wood School. He was the first black person to be in Grant Wood. And,
oh, do you know if you could point to it? Like
12th Avenue and 10th Street.
Okay.
The old Metro School. Do you know where Metro is?
Yes.
That was Tyler.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah. So I do know that kind of like our claim to fame as Iowans is we are the first state to legally integrate our public school system in 1868. So go us. I do know that a lot of the times when we're pointing to public school integration, that doesn't align typically with housing. And so again, like pre-1968, it would have been totally chill and fine to legally discriminate against someone based on their housing. And we can also really see this in rental. Renting is like a really important part of redlining. So, you know, if you're trying to move up the economic ladder and you can't buy a home, and then you aren't allowed to rent a home in a school district, that's going to be a really important way for people to continue to segregate schools. I don't know anything specifically about Tyler. In a different version of this presentation, we had a map of where all the schools are, and we just have physically fewer school buildings in a lot of these redlined areas. When you get out into the blue, there's just like more schools in general, both private and public. But I would assume that having a like being able to distinctly remember the first time you had a black student wouldn't be out of the ordinary, both in Iowa and just in general. Sorry if that didn't like fully clarify it, but okay, yeah, that I feel like that like makes sense historically. I can't really give you like a more than that, but like it like doesn't sound out of the ordinary like at all.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. Yeah. It puts a lot of details into areas that people know something about, but maybe not more. There's also a very informative This American Life. It's called, oh gosh, Open House or The House or something like that. You can look it up. Mitt Romney's father, surprisingly enough, was championing the Fair Housing Act when Nixon was trying not to. And so that's a very interesting aspect that comes up. Also, if you were white and wanted to buy a house in the redlined area, you couldn't. So it was definitely not necessarily economic. It was definitely race because they wouldn't let you. My family in the Bronx, New York, very heterogeneous neighborhood when I moved in. It was Italian and Jewish. We were the first Black family. My sister and I were the first Black kids in the school. And by the time I was 18, it was pretty much Black. It's going in reverse now. The part that the people who moved to the suburbs decided when gas started going up, they didn't want to drive all the way in. So they started buying houses now. Washington, D.C. used to be called Chocolate City. It is not anymore. It is very much turning to a white neighborhood. So much so that there are white people walking their dogs on an HBCU campus and not cleaning up after them and saying, you need to move the campus if you don't like us walking our dogs here. Yeah, and so a lot of these people moving back into the city are really not nice to the people. It's not just the economic part of it. It is the people who are moving in are really hostile to the people who live there, because if they pay $2 million for their house, they don't want you living next door to them. And if you have a $2 million house and they don't like you because you're Black, then they are going to make your life miserable. And another resource, Nicole Hannah Brown, and Nicole Hannah, I
do that all the time too.
I do. I give her Brown, Smith, Johnson. You know,
I get the order wrong all the time.
Hometown girl. She's from Waterloo. She did a thing about education for the New York Times about 4 or 5 years ago. That's something else you could Google. Very, very informative about what's going on with people moving back to neighborhoods. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yes. Another really cool resource kind of in this similar vein, the University of Richmond basically has a database where they take every redline map that you can find. And so we sent some of ours in to be like, we have them. And you can see sort of around the country, like where is redline. So if I didn't grow up in Iowa, I kind of looked up all the different cities I've lived in to see how they were redlined. So yes, it's called Mapping Inequality. So it's the same title as ours, which makes it really easy to Google. University of Richmond. It's crazy. That's how we found the Boone map. We don't know who found it, but they have it on their website. Yes.
We have a question from online.
Yeah.
What happened to former occupants of gentrified neighborhoods?
Yes, great question. And it ties really well to sort of what you're talking about over here. And so when we see, and we can still see it today, like you can kind of see it in the architecture, even driving down First Avenue. A lot of the times, just sort of like in the nature of how the economy works, right? Whoever has the most money gets to buy what they want to buy. When we have people coming in and buying land for cheaper or buying land for cheaper than they could get elsewhere, they're building these houses that the people who were originally living on that land can't afford. So if I, move into a neighborhood that has been historically redlined or has been historically of a lower economic standing than me, I can buy a house and build a $2 million house in what used to be just sort of like a regular middle class or working class neighborhood. And simply because we have a housing shortage, like sort of around the nation, right? This isn't a uniquely Cedar Rapids or Iowa problem. There just aren't enough buildings for people to live in. Those people who are priced out of a newly gentrified neighborhood oftentimes really struggle to find a place that they can afford to live in that's either nearby or that they can afford to live in, period, just because we don't really have enough like physical buildings to put everyone who wants a house in. I was just apartment hunting in Wisconsin and it was crazy. So it's kind of simply like whoever has the cheese gets to buy the house. So I know in a lot of these hyper segregated neighborhoods, that's when we start to see really like dense housing of people who are, staying with family or kind of trying to buy. They usually get priced into a smaller building than they were usually living in because that's what they can afford to buy now that the rest of the rent has gone up. So a lot of the times we just sort of see these, especially with people of color, these communities that have been historically kind of pushed into one area, then get priced out with gentrification. They just sort of dissolve, which leaves us with a lot of like lacking sort of community and cultural resources as well.
Just out of curiosity, I'm wondering if the heat map is pre or post derecho. Not that it would change the overall result.
Yes. I want to say post because it's pretty new. It's like last couple of years. I'm assuming post, but it's a good question just of like trees, of like what trees are still around.
That's right.
Yeah. I did find it on the city's website and you can zoom out and they have Iowa City on there too. We don't have a redline map of Iowa City, so I didn't put it on there, but I know they have a heat map of Iowa City as well. Yes.
Let me put a plug in for this church because about a decade before the Fair Housing Act of '68 was passed, some 60 years ago, this church helped dent the red line by selling land which it owned to a new doctor in town who happened to be black, and overcome a very vocal minority of white people that not in my neighborhood. We didn't want this doctor.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, I think what's really cool about this presentation is that we get a lot of stories like that of like, I remember when it was a big deal when this person moved into town. I was telling my parents about this presentation, and my dad grew up on the south side of Chicago, and he says he remembers his neighbors were selling their house and their people kept stealing their for sale sign out of their yard because they didn't want a black family to like drive by and see that a house was for sale. And so it's very like word of mouth of like, oh, my neighbor's selling his house, like you can move in there because I know who you are. And so I think I really like hearing like kind of those stories of like, oh, I remember when this happened, or I remember hearing about this. So thank you. Yes, excellent.
Another online question. It seems a powerful mechanism reinforcing racism is the link between home ownership or area of living and public schooling. Could we ever uncouple those by redoing school funding in districts?
I mean, as like an individual, like as a non-representative of the African American state of Iowa, I think yes. I mean, I think that when you look at the way education is structured, historically, like when you go back to sort of like inventing the public school, it's very much like, oh, like all the kids in the town will just go to that building and like that lady will teach them. And so I think if you really wanted to focus on like actually integrating schools, it really comes down to people don't want to integrate schools because they know that some schools just have more money than others, and how much money your school has is going to impact your ability to like go further in life. So I think that yes, that the way we fund education has the potential to like really remedy a lot of the problems that we've been having since, you know, pre-Fair Housing Act, pre-Brown v. Board. But they're very hard to get people on board with, especially when it comes to education, I believe. Yes.
Hi, I have two things, one comment and one question. Where did people grow up in this country that seem to think that people are unequal? I don't know, but you know, all of us here probably heard early on, but from the time we were 4 years old, right through whatever education we got, that all people are created equal. And I just can't figure out where all of this prejudice and racism by over, 30 to 40% of our country has. It just baffles me. Anyway, and then I wondered if you know anything about what is being done in our community of Cedar Rapids, and I'm not quite for sure, to make more equal the opportunities for lending money to people of a minority group or of non-white people traditionally. What's being done here? And I think that a lot of our credit unions here are making a big effort to get money out to minority groups for a mortgage if they need it. But do you think there's a significant effort for that here in Cedar Rapids and in Iowa? And I'm from Des Moines, and I know what you're talking about in Des Moines, and I also have family in Milwaukee. And I was just stunned when I heard that Milwaukee has one of the highest racially motivated housing schemes in the whole country. So anyway, thank you.
Yes. First question of sort of like how we still have this like prevalence of racial prejudice, I think is one of those questions that there's too many answers to be able to narrow it down. I think it's really fascinating that in my experience, both as like teaching college students and then in this job, everyone knows that like interpersonal racism is bad and that you shouldn't do that. And no one wants to be accused of this interpersonal racism of like not wanting to sit next to someone on the bus or like go to school with someone who's a different race than you. But where you lose them is the systemic part, because I think it's harder to wrap your brain around the fact that if people have interpersonal racism and then I become a judge, I bring that with me and I like use that in the way I do my job. I think that that is kind of where you start to lose people in terms of like how to change systems that have been used to perpetuate racism. So I think just like the best way is to just like have that conversation and start it and to point out the like, oh, but like if someone's racist like at the grocery store, don't you think they're going to be racist when they work at the bank? Like you bring that with you. But yes, I don't know if that answers your question fully, but that's in my brain, that's how I see it, as like having these conversations. In terms of like what happens in Cedar Rapids, I know that just in general, we, like the rest of America, like just don't have enough houses to put people in. I think that, like you said, like a lot of credit unions have like financial literacy programs and sort of just like when you go to the bank, like what are they going to ask you for? Like what paperwork do you have to bring? And so I think this push to make the financial part of life more transparent just helps all of us. I mean, like it makes it just less stressful, less scary, and less intimidating. I'm from Milwaukee, and I grew up in the suburbs, went to a high school that is now like pretty racially diverse, but when it was first created was essentially all white. It's where Oprah went to high school when she lived in Milwaukee. She left because she said everyone was racist. So we were like, that makes sense if you were in Milwaukee in the 1960s. And then like when I was living in Milwaukee after college, I was living at home and I would drive 10 minutes south and work at an elementary school on the other side of the highway that was 100% Black. We had no students that weren't Black. And so the racial makeup is so stark, like you cross that highway and it's like you're in a different world. And that wasn't really something that when I was growing up, people talked about until I was kind of like late in high school. And I think it was because they knew that the interpersonal component of racism is bad and like you don't want to be accused of that. But that systemic thing is just harder to want to change because it's so big. But yes, and that's why I think like talking about it is so, for me, it's fun because I see people's eyes like being like, oh, like I get it now. But it also makes people really uncomfortable. Yeah. Yes.
In terms of where people go, I know in California, when the white people had moved out, they were planning an airport and were going to like move the whole operation out to like Palmdale. When that didn't work out and they started coming back, the government started putting Section 8 people and people who were on assistance in those areas. So now you have like reservations that are far away from the action, so to speak. So they don't ever talk about public transportation. It's really bad in California. So those people don't ever get away from there. So they don't have any idea what goes on a personal level in the rest of the world. And in terms of like interpersonal racism, and nobody wants to be accused of that, it's not even only that they don't want to be accused of that. I had friends when I was growing up who would say things like, well, Bonnie's not really Negro. So it's like they give you a pass. It's not like it changes their view. They give you a pass because you're just not like them. You're different. So, and there is, like you said, there are numbers of answers, but one of them is it's a tool. When people want to control a certain group of people, they give the bugaboo to the other group of people. So as long as you're better, Lyndon Johnson said it, as long as you can make a white man feel like he is better than a Negro, you have his vote. That in action today.
Yes. That was really, yeah, that's exactly, I think that that's what makes these conversations so interesting too, is like you hear these examples of like, oh, well, like she doesn't count. Like she doesn't count as Black because X, Y, Z. And it shows us how a lot of these boxes are so made up that, I mean, like 100 years ago, I'm 50% Irish. Like I would hardly have counted. But because of the way I look now, like because whiteness is so important to like moving that step ahead in the system we've created for ourselves, like I'm super white. And so I think it's so in talking about race and talking about racism is trying to take away the things that make people uncomfortable, and oftentimes it's the blame or like the wanting to admit you're wrong. And so I think a lot of the times when people hear new information and it doesn't match with what they've pictured in their brain, they think it's their fault that they didn't know something, or they think that, you know, I don't want to admit I'm wrong because what if I look dumb? And so I think just admitting when you don't know something or admitting that you've changed your mind and giving people room to change their mind can be tricky. And some people just won't, and that's like their prerogative, like that's their right. But letting people ask questions that they really want to know the answers to is my favorite part of my job. Of like, people will ask me questions, they'll be like, I'm so sorry, this might sound dumb, but blah blah blah, and I'm like, no, that's a really good question and I guarantee someone else had it. So I think that from like a how to handle it systemically now, kind of like step one is to just talk about it, because it kind of gives people a new lens to look at. Okay, so like when I go to the bank, do you think I'm treated differently because of my race? Or, you know, do you think that when I went to the bank 20 years ago and got a mortgage for my house, do you think I was treated differently? And so kind of just like giving them that prompt to start looking at it, which I feel like it sounds kind of like a cop-out answer, but the problem with systemic racism is that it's so big, and that, you know, housing leads to education and education leads to jobs and jobs lead to housing. And so kind of the first step I think a lot of people can take in their daily lives is just like trying to talk about it with other people. And that transparency, if you don't know something, is kind of like, it's hard, but it's really important, and it's very brave to be like, I just don't know what this means. Around the country, that's tricky. I mean, what's interesting is this is the kind of a very hyper-specific example, but when we look at the history of busing, because busing can only be enforced in school districts that had explicit racial guidelines, like it can only be if you directly are like, only white students can come to this school, you can force those schools to bus. When you look at the racial makeup of most schools today in the United States, schools in the South and like in historically like super hyper segregated Jim Crow areas are way more likely to be integrated than schools in the North. And so I think that when like education is hard policy to move around, because it's like people's kids and people are obviously going to be very defensive of their kids. But when you look at how busing has kind of worked by making everyone a little annoyed, it is a good example of like, if we're all mad about it, it means it's probably working, which sounds awful, but that's kind of the best example of like why schools today in the South are way more integrated than schools in Milwaukee, like where I went to school. Yes. Thank you.
Testing. So, okay. Are you aware of any oversight measures in place that inhibit the possibility of systemic racism happening through Iowa's education voucher program?
Another good question. I know right off the bat that when it comes to like private school vouchers, a big issue, which isn't directly connected to racism, but you could like see how it is like a next step later, is that a lot of private schools aren't required to have special education programs. I worked in special education for a while, and I think that, you know, it's individual education plans. Because of the nature of systemic racism, kids of color are like much more likely to be on the bottom rung of that system and kind of be left out in the dirt because they are viewed as, you know, a Black kid with a behavior issue. Black students are much more likely to be suspended regardless if they have IEPs. They are much more likely to be viewed as like aggressive. And so if they're, you know, being viewed as different than their peers because of these kind of like both interpersonal and systemic nature of discrimination, you know, are they going to be denied from that private school because, you know, on their record, they have these behavior needs? That was kind of a long answer. Does that make sense? I'm worried I talked myself in a circle. But I think that in general, when you don't give everyone, regardless of where they live, a fair shot at like an equal footing with education, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure, which I think is so interesting to think about the way education has changed in Iowa, especially because we were like the premier destination for Black students, especially in college, right? We're the first Big Ten university to admit men and women on an equal footing. We're one of the first medical schools to admit Black students and women on equal footing with white men. And so I think that we have such potential to make our education system sort of like the draw, but you have to be able to give everyone a fair shot regardless of like what they bring into school with them.
I will add to that. But first,
Yes.
Please help me to thank Sydney O'Hare, please. To add to the question and Sydney's answer on vouchers and non-public private schools, non-public private schools also simply don't have to accept any student. They are receiving state dollars in a multitude of ways, not only just vouchers, but they have no requirement to accept any particular student. And the other piece of it is that they can kick a student out at any point in time. And with vouchers, they get to retain all of the funding. So they could be a month in, decide that they can't teach that child and they can kick them out. And the third piece is they don't typically provide the services required by an IEP. Who provides that? AEAs. And we have them, but we're working very hard as a state to harm that system as well. So it's very complicated. And we have always been opposed to vouchers as an organization, and partially because we don't believe that state dollars should be used in a manner that does not put people on an equal footing. So, Sydney, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Invaluable information, and I encourage you to continue to learn more. When the museum opens in
May 11th.
May 11th. Do go and visit, and I'm excited to be able to go as well during one of our visits. I will remind you of the process that they have for recycling and all of that. Take all of your stuff to the folks. Next month, May 3rd, so Intersections is always the first Friday of the month from September to May. So our final session for the calendar, the school year is, I'm going to just say his name how I always say it wrong, I'm sure, is Professor Peter Yawianen. Close enough. You all know him. Professor of religion at Kirkwood Community College. He's going to talk about, this is very timely, women's rights and women's bodies, Christian conservatives, and the ongoing battle over female autonomy. And it's very relevant because we have an Iowa Supreme Court case that oral arguments will be next Thursday on the 6-week ban on abortion. We expect for those oral arguments to happen and for the decision to come out sometime in June. So very interested in what the professor has to say. So thank you for being part of Intersections. Thank you for being here or online, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.